Okay, so at the risk of trying everybody's patience, at the end of the day, I just want to present a few reflections on issues around big data that have partly arisen from a project that I've been engaged on with researchers at Goldsmiths College and at Lancaster University, partly from long-term research that I've been doing on artificial intelligence and partly from work project I've been doing looking at information in the NHS. So the paper it's an engagement with, it's an attempt to think about how one might engage critically in a constructive way with big data. The project that I alluded to just a second ago is kind of a big data project. We're looking at GitHub, which is an online code repository and versioning system, which is of interest to us because it has over 5 million coding projects on it, and we're able to explore Google's NoSQL BigQuery search facility to explore it and to think a little bit about how kind of NoSQL query packages, APIs associated with very large web platforms, statistical modelling packages such as R and Python and so on, shape the kinds of knowledges that can be produced through something which I guess is a bit like big data. I don't particularly want to talk about that today. What I would like to talk about really are some of the issues that arise from exploring and problematising big data. I kind of called the paper Techniques of Abstraction in Ecology Practices, kind of big, kind of frothy title. I don't think the paper is as frothy as the abstract might suggest. Essentially what I'm interested in here is the issue of the role of information infrastructures in shaping data. I'm interested in the kind of subtle mutations and shifts that occur when working with tools and technologies of statistical analysis and big data contexts. And I'm actually just more broadly concerned with what it is that big data practices actually do. So I'm sort of trying to address that question about, well, what is big data in the broader, what might big data be in the broader scheme of things? I'd just like to thank Yannis very much for giving me the opportunity to talk. Okay, so I talked about abstraction in the title of the paper. The reference there actually has to do with a broader issue that I'm concerned with, which is to say, how is it that abstraction operates as a real process operative in the world and not simply as an epistemic thing that happens in people's heads? So it's kind of, I'm interested in how data practices could be considered as practices of real abstraction. The idea of real abstraction itself is not a new idea. It has a venerable, some might say disreputable provenance in the work of Marx. That I think in itself is quite interesting because it allows some interesting connections to be made between big data and questions around political economy. There's some interesting work around looking at social media. I'm not so sure yet that the work on social media has made the transition from thinking about political economy into big data, but there are some issues there that it's worth considering. Again, I don't particularly want to consider those, although it is of course very, very difficult not to think about issues to do with political economy when looking at big data practices, particularly given the importance that big data is presented as having in reference to issues of kind of value extraction in a global economy. But like I said, I don't particularly want to talk about that. I do actually want to make a simple point about the problem, and this is a kind of methodological point, make an observation about the problem of adopting, say, a more explicitly political economy approach to thinking about processes and practices of abstraction of the kind we find with big data. And this is political economy is largely unable to address the singularity of the practices with which it's dealing. It's a case typically of seeing in big data the same old story. Automation, streamlining, extraction of surplus value, etc. And this is a perception which presumes, typically to turn that presumption into something like an inevitability, that the practices with which one is dealing when one approaches them from a political economic point of view are just like other practices. They arise from the same logic whether we want to figure that as kind of instrumental rationality, as you might do in a sort of Weberian tradition, or the dynamic of capitalist exploitation in the Marxist tradition. I think this is a problem because in this way the trajectories, translations and transformations that specific practices undergo as they move out, say, of computing science departments into the labs of IT corporations, and from IT corporations then into the corporate world more generally, tend to become somewhat invisible. The complexities and details of knowledge practices from this point of view become rather too easily simplified, and much of what is laboriously and contingently constructed comes to assume weight of inevitability. Another issue on the side there is considered in this way really is a political economic point of view really tends to find very little, or by definition almost, worth saving from big data, because it's just kind of bound up with this idea of exploitation.
Excuse me, it seems that you are presenting sheets that we cannot see.
Sorry?
Are you presenting sheets that we cannot see?
Slides. No, I'm not presenting slides at all. So
you want to look
if you want to look at, I'm sorry, I can't give you slides to look at. Somebody once described PowerPoint as Stalinism in information design. I largely accept that viewpoint. So I don't use PowerPoint.
You're free to make up your own.
You can daydream and search your web pages as you feel free. So I think that, anyway, the point is here, from a kind of sociological, critical point of view, I suggest it's important not to amalgamate things too quickly. We need to slow down and not to launch precipitously into asking the kinds of questions that we can and do ask when we are dealing with a set of practices that are assumed to have become one stable, stabilised and self-evident thing. And I think it's interesting, and this is an aside that I would be an interesting subject of the conference in itself. There is a kind of rhetoric around big data and the commentary on big data that really tends to kind of overstate its coherence, overstate its unity, overstate its kind of stability, and overstate its coherence. And I think that's a bit of a problem because when one starts to look at what's happening in big data, piece together its history, look at the relationships between, say, the kind of computing techniques that involve the organisation of practices and so on, that unity tends to collapse a little bit. So there are two key issues on this work. One concerns data infrastructure and the other concerns techniques of analysis, and I'll talk about those in turn. So I think one of the quite striking things to note when one starts to consider issues about data and infrastructure is the way in which big data practices historically do not emerge as any kind of scientific project at all. So notwithstanding subsequent rationalizations with the now kind of obligatory references to paradigm shifts, game changers, turns, revolutions and so on, numerous of the early research papers that profile computational innovations marking out the development of big data, which will frequently be fruit of work in R&D branches of tech corporations, are striking for the way in which the kinds of problems that they address are linked to very specific technical issues, to which those associated with working on data extracted from the internet. So there are a set of discussions that really emerge out of the contingencies of trying to deal with the kind of data that is generated, Google is generating, how do you optimise search and so on and so forth. Now, if these early research problems may be plausibly considered to be side effects of ongoing attempts to optimise search on the internet, subsequent broader attempts at interesting actors other than those initial research communities concerned with very precise technical problems typically present big data practices as a rational way of responding to vast quantities of data generated through click streams, social media content, business transactions, and so on. And we've seen that. That's been a feature of some of the commentary that we've heard earlier on today. So a special issue of Harvard Business Review that deals with the so-called management revolution accomplished as a result of big data tends to present this shift to data-driven decision-making as a response to an apparently spontaneous explosion in digital data. Now, the key point about these framings of big data is not just that what data is collected on is in reality a function of an uninterrogated growth of a disparate and sometimes messy web-based epistemic set of web-based epistemic, technical, social, cultural, and economic activities. It's also that big data analytic practices have emerged as a side effect of this proliferation, and as a result, the self-evident there-ness of data and the temporality of the analytic responses to it, the fact that they come after, tends to help create a powerful sense of naturalisation. The data of big data are often presented as occurring in the wild, a reference that makes a connection with the kind of naturally occurring data that one might expect to gather in the field sciences seem obvious and unproblematic. And I think that's a problem because, as Lisa Giffermans has said in a nicely titled book, raw data is an oxymoron. Having said that, I think there is a very precise connection to be made between big data and knowledge infrastructures, specifically in those definitions, and I use that term loosely, specifically in those definitions of it which refer to quantities of data that are simply too large to be located in traditional relational database management systems. So if these kinds of definitions are frustratingly imprecise, the reference to the database is nevertheless historically particularly handy, because as well as pointing inexorably to a problematic of information infrastructure that is of crucial if unremarked importance for scientific practices, the traditional database has arguably been something of a key marker for that infrastructure as it developed throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. This is a point that Jeff Bowker has made in his work on information infrastructure studies. So to talk about big data in terms of data that exceeds the capacities of traditional database storage techniques is, in some respects at least, to flag up a connection between big data and the information infrastructures of knowledge practices per se. However, it seems to me this is an aspect that perhaps doesn't really attract too much attention in the proliferating frothy commentary about big data. So the way in which big data practices have emerged as something of a reaction to the heteronomous production of large volumes of data matters though, not least because of what it can allow us to forget about the ways in which data is produced in knowledge practices more generally, and the role of technical devices and infrastructure in producing, refining and stabilising data. Part of the discussion about big data and its allure must, I think, be situated here in terms of the practices of knowledge, science and technical innovation, and not in terms, perhaps, of the analytically useless references to the scientific method. So Chris Anderson's paper in Wired refers to the way in which big data makes the scientific method redundant. I'm not entirely sure what the scientific method actually is, as he refers to it. Now here I want to make a contrast or a point of comparison with meteorology and climatology, because I think this tells us something interesting about the absolutely crucial importance of information infrastructures in the generation of scientific knowledge. So the comparison is helpful not least because these two sciences could, I think, reasonably claim to be the first heavily computational data crunching knowledge practices, aside from kind of, attempts to sort out missile guidance systems. In his recent account of the history of climatology and meteorology, Paul Edwards has made a good case for seeing these two sciences as bound up with what he calls infrastructural globalism, an echo of Martin Keeson's concept of information globalism. The qualities of knowledge produced by these sciences is inseparable from the infrastructures that make them possible to stabilise and sometimes destabilise them. That is to say, from the problems that are associated with the production and exchange of global data. Global data was a feature of research into weather and climate well before the invention of the World Wide Web, so it's hardly surprising to find that advocates of the revolutionary qualities of big data find precursors for it in the early history of climatology and meteorology. But what is really interesting here is that a closer study of the genesis of climatology as a global field science reveals that for practitioners to be sure of collecting reliable data when trying to make broad predictions about weather trends, climate trends. Numerous examples of what Jeff Bowker refers to as infrastructural inversion have been required. Infrastructural inversion is a kind of gestalt switching process for an analyst in which the technologies and arrangements that make knowledge of weather possible, in this instance, are brought to the fore and examined for themselves. In other words, in their endeavours to acquire reliable historical data series, as Edwards points out, climate scientists have had to display acute sensitivity to the ways in which the infrastructure through which their data is gathered affect the nature of the data that they are using. They have to learn to filter out factors that might preclude the homogeneity and hence comparability of the data gathered over long periods of time using different kinds of infrastructure. The kind of knowledge that climate science generates can only begin to be considered valid because of the learning process that scientists have had to engage in to understand the ways in which technological devices impact on that data. Now, I think this is an important point because it tells us something about how scientists working with a knowledge infrastructure have been obliged not to take that infrastructure for granted. They need, in other words, an intimate knowledge of the impact of that knowledge infrastructure on the data that they can gather. And what Edwards sees as infrastructure inversion here, it kind of might be seen as a rather unrepresentative example of what happens in scientific practice. Not every scientific practice is field science, not every field science operates in quite the same way as climatology. However, I'm not entirely sure that this is the case. If we follow Andrew Pickering, for example, in his work on the manual of practice, he argues that any scientific practice entails what he calls a dance of agency, the relationship between scientists and the machines that they use to gather data. A dance of agency is a kind of choreography of human practitioner and machine in the production of reliable observations, reliable data. Developing machines to perform specific roles embroils the scientist in a process of what he calls interactive stabilizations, in which machines both accommodate and resist the intentions of scientists, testifying through that resistance to the importance for scientists of learning what their objects and research problems require of them. To put it in a slightly different way, data is not simply what is given here. In the dance of scientist and device in the laboratory, data is produced through the invention of machinery which the scientist will understand intimately. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is twofold. The first is that data and knowledge practice is intrinsically connected to technical machinery and infrastructure, albeit in very different ways, say in field science such as meteorology or laboratory science. The second is that scientific knowledge practices entail an intimate understanding of the technical machines that are responsible for the production of that data, whether that understanding is acquired through the specific and deliberate construction of the machine for specific and experimental purposes, or in a rather more complicated way through a problematization of what the infrastructure has otherwise allowed scientists to take for granted. And it's noteworthy here then that the complexity of the concern with data and the sometimes detailed work of infrastructure inversion that Edwards notes as characteristic of the way that climate scientists have engaged in the development of global data is strikingly absent from accounts of big data. The givenness of the data, its rhetorical figuring as a quasi-spontaneous explosion or deluge, obviates any sense of considering where that data comes from, how the devices through which it is generated and the design of software that allow those devices to work in the way that they do might shape it. Obviously that's not entirely the case, and you find extensive discussions in technical documentation about how to manipulate data once you have it in a database and so on and so forth, but that's not quite the issue that I'm pointing at. So you do find discussions about comparability and provenance and so on. More frequently, the technical discussions, as I say, tend to concern matters of how to manipulate data efficiently, the collection of which per se is not a problem. So the point here then is that questions about infrastructure, about machinery and about their importance within scientific practice matter because they tell us something about what is problematic about big data as a knowledge practice or set of knowledge practices. They suggest that if we wish to get a better understanding of what big data practices are doing, it will be necessary to engage in some of our own forms of infrastructure inversion, and not least because this doesn't seem to be an issue of any great concern amongst data analysts. So that's the first issue, really. This is something that has arisen out of the work that we've been doing. How exactly does the API of GitHub, for example, shape what it is we can extract and the inferences and conclusions that we can draw about coding practices? And that kind of leads to a more general, as Ed needs to a more general consideration about, well, what is it, how is it that the kind of devices that we use to gather data often very unproblematically impact on what it is that one can't say. So actually I think good example there would be the ICD-10 codes that Yanis referred to earlier. They are not neutral translations of what diseases are. There is, for example, a heavy weighting in favour of women being ill compared to men. And this is actually quite an important thing for someone who wants to engage with big data critically to be able to do. Think about how the infrastructures, and there are myriad forms of technical infrastructure in big data, how they shape what it is we're dealing with. So that's the first issue. The second issue which I want to look at briefly concerns what might change, if you like, when some of the tools and techniques of statistical analysis that are so significant in big data practices are pressed into service on big data problems. It's interesting here, just as an example, to consider neural networks. And one of the reasons I talk about neural networks is I've done work with them in the past, so I know a little bit about them technically. It seems to me that the way in which a neural network technology such as the restricted Boltzmann machine developed by Hinton and Senyovsky has been used might be a good example of the shifting and subtle redefinition problems to which algorithms, machine learning techniques and so on are subject under conditions of big data. One of the reasons why I mentioned the restricted Boltzmann machine is that it's been used by Netflix for a recommendation system for their online operation. The neural networks have experienced considerable success in the form of research in statistical physics. Indeed, the Boltzmann machine and the restricted Boltzmann machine derive their names from the idea of the Boltzmann distribution, referring to the probability distribution of the states of systems explored in statistical mechanics. Now, of course, in physics, neural networks are used to analyse systems that are closed, both theoretically and practically, let's say in terms of the protocols of the experiments in which the data is gathered. And whilst I'm not entirely sure whether the restricted Boltzmann machine of the kind used by Netflix in its recommendation system has much use in the research of physicists, the borrowings made from the language of physics, for starters, suggest a kind of continuity between the problems addressed by statistical analysis within the field of science and elsewhere. But there are problems with this, it seems to me. For example, it's not at all certain that assumptions about closed systems that pertain to Boltzmann distribution would necessarily apply to data that is collected about consumers' purchasing preferences, for example. But there are other more pointed problems that need to be addressed. It seems to me here that one of the key stakes in research in physics is to distinguish between what is fact and what is artifact, i.e. the aim is to generate reliable witnesses. It's vital that the data that a detection device collects, organised around the questions that the physicist wants to ask of some imputed agent, can demonstrate that the agent is indifferent to us. If we put it in these terms, we might start to note a quite striking difference between the way in which data analysis techniques operate in relation to experimental physics and how something like a restricted Boltzmann machine is employed in the development of the recommendation system. In the latter case, I'm not really sure whether we can say that the kind of testing of data that pertains to physicists really occurs, and whether it's really the same. Of course, one can and does falsify hypotheses about the data that one has gathered, but the terms on which that data is gathered are such that it's rather difficult to raise the question as to whether or not the agents to which the patterns of data are attributed, in the case of the restricted Boltzmann machine for the recommendation system, the Netflix customer, shall we say, it's not really certain whether or not that agent is in a position to contest that data. Your likes and dislikes are always framed in terms of an understanding of you as a Netflix customer. And I think this is important because all sorts of interesting questions about whether or not this might be a good way, say, of framing the liking or disliking of film, questions that might allow us to contest the artifact of the customer that the data gathered constructs, disappear. That the data is being gathered about populations that are already addressed as consumers is what the neural network analysis with the restricted Boltzmann machine recommendation system has to accept. Now, by highlighting this, I'm exaggerating a little bit the difference, and it's a kind of slightly caricatured contrast between physics, which is obviously not one thing, and kind of neural networks in big data analysis. But by highlighting this kind of difference between the use of statistical learning techniques in existing knowledge practice and in big data practice, what I'm trying to do is draw on the insights of the philosopher of science Isabel Stengers, and more particularly her insistence on differentiating between scientific and technical practices. Indeed, it seems to me that doing so is an important prerequisite to resisting what she calls the effects of fascination associated with discourse about the inexorable techno-scientific redefinition of the world, which is a kind of characterisation that applies very nicely in a workshop constituted as an investigation into the world of big data. Doing this for me, though, is not an excuse for saving science from technology. Highlighting the difference between a scientific knowledge practice and a technical practice actually is quite the contrary. It's a way of highlighting the different stakes of technical and scientific practice. Of course, when I say that there is a difference here between a technical practice, and I think that the use of restricted Boltzmann machines for the development of a recommendation system is much more a technical practice than it is a knowledge practice, at least in that sense of scientific sense. Although I'm saying that there are very clear differences, it mustn't escape our attention that different techniques do migrate around within scientific practices. So nuclear magnetic resonance, for example, is something that starts out in physics and it migrates to biology, for example. I'm not saying that this sort of thing isn't a problem. This is a problem. But I think it's important to note that what happens when a technique, or what might be a scientific technique in one context migrates somewhere else, is that the obligations of the practices that use that technique start to change. So the kinds of obligations that the practitioners have to answer to shift when a technique migrates towards places where answers are developed to questions that are not part of the scientific practice. So whilst magnetic resonance imaging, for example, is still involved in the obligation that its users have of developing an argument or finding a proof when it migrates from physics into the field of biology, for example, it's not clear that the obligations imposed on the practitioner using a neural network algorithm are the same when those statistical techniques migrate out of, say, particle physics or theoretical biology into the field of marketing. The imperative is to find something that works and not something that proves. Now, a techno-scientific approach to big data at this point, I think, would probably insist on the continuity between statistical learning in science and in big data, and refer us, as in fact is often the case, to the logical and mathematical foundations behind both. However, I think the problem with that, once we do that, is it becomes rather easy to lose sight of the ways in which practices, techniques, and so on get subtly transformed in the process of being translated from one domain to another. So I think the way in which the kinds of obligations that using a neural network when working in marketing, for example, the kinds of obligations that one is answerable to there compared to the obligations that one is answerable to when one's doing statistical analysis using a neural network in particle physics. Those kinds of things get missed if what we're focusing on is the kind of the underlying, what we presume is the underlying scientific principles that inform the way that algorithm operates statistically. It's no insult to big data practices to want to see them as being something like technical practices in this respect. In fact, I think that might even be a way of celebrating their remarkable inventiveness and ingenuity. So the point I'm making here is not that big data practices don't produce knowledge, they do produce knowledge, of course. Rather, it's simply that we fail to understand, or we can fail to understand, significant details of the way such practices operate if we simply focus our attention on that part of what it is that they do. So if we focus on the knowledge and think about how the knowledge might be related to some set of first principles, we can ignore what is actually changing in the transition from one place to another. So in this respect, and I think this is an issue that requires much closer attention, I think there might be something like an important discussion to be had around the different senses that words in the kind of discourse around big data, words such as optimization operate. So, and the reason this optimization means very, very different things to different kinds of practitioners who might work within big data analysis practices. We can talk about the optimization of technical implementations of an algorithm. We can talk about optimization of the fit between models and data. We can talk about optimization as a theoretical construct in the kind of quasi-biological discourse, say, that is operative in neural network theory, and so on and so forth. I think addressing those differences of meaning and trying to tease them apart a little bit when we might look at big data practices would be important, because those differences of meaning would allow us, in fact, to trace out some of the entanglements operative within big data analysis. I think that might be a little bit too much of a discussion to have here today. To round my presentation off, I'd like now really to address the question that I think follows on from what I've just been saying about the kind of mutations, that affect the way in which kind of analysis techniques might shift when they move, say, into a marketing department or into supporting marketing practice. If the kind of big data practices that I've referred to do not really do some of the things that we might associate with scientific knowledge practices, so if there is, as I think is the case, a lack of interest in the kind of perhaps very important and subtle ways in which information infrastructure shapes the data that you're gathering, should be absolutely prerequisite for a scientist. If that isn't happening, if there isn't really correlated to that, isn't really a serious attempt to engage in a distinction between fact and artifact and the proof associated with it, if the question is about finding something that works. If then big data practices are not about the kind of proof that can be produced by the production of reliable witnesses that would resist the tests that we impose on them, what is it that big data practices do? What is it that big data practices are about if the kind of relationship between indicators and some underlying reality that might be purported to represent isn't really being interrogated in such a way that we can distinguish between fact and artifact? What is a recommendation system that by definition cannot call into question the prior definition of its data population as consumers doing when it produces an analysis of what we like? What are we doing if our analysis of sentiment on Twitter cannot escape the explicit or implicit framing of its population as Twitter users? Here I think we have to move away from epistemic practices and even technical practices into a problematic of power governance and control. Again, I don't necessarily mean this in a negative sense at all. I mean this, actually in that kind of Foucauldian rather positive sense of power as action on action. It is, of course, by definition the case that there is a power dynamic at play when the knowledge generated about a population is generated in such a way that a population cannot contest the terms on which and by which they are characterised. This being the case, the power effects of that relationship become evident in the way that populations then come to understand themselves in terms of that knowledge. To put it slightly differently, we might say that there is a performative quality to the power dynamic inherent in certain kinds of knowledge-gathering practices. Now, the point I'm making here is not new in the slightest. The idea that populations come to understand themselves through the statistical classifications that are generated of them is very well known and has been insisted on by numerous writers on statistics. It would be surprising then if we didn't observe something similar in the case of big data. However, I think that in some respects big data adds an interesting twist to this issue. So let me return to my kind of slightly simplified example of the recommendation system. What about recommendation systems in kind of fairly public discussions about them? And it's a point that's actually that is less often mentioned in the more excitable literature about them, is that they aim to optimise, and I use that term advisedly because it is complicated, the relationship between supply and demand. It's a problem of crucial importance in an era of just-in-time production. Seeking to learn what customers ostensibly want and programmatically suggest other items to them is not a matter of simple convenience or of giving people what they want. in the programmatic operation of learning about patterns of preference and translating that into a series of recommendations made visible on screen, something else is going on. And I think, and I'm going to start speculating a little bit here, in particular I think there is a tendential process of transferring learning away from a customer to a machine. So in this respect, we might suggest, we might argue, that what is in fact being modelled here with our recommendation system using clever statistical learning techniques, when learning passes into the machine, is that the customer or the decision maker as such, the customer or decision maker, sorry, let me get this right. In this respect, it might be argued that what is in fact being modelled here when learning passes into the machine is the customer or the decision maker as such. A customer or decision maker who, in his or her capacity for response, is being continuously modulated. So the statistics are being used to generate recommendations that change the data environment in which the customer or the decision maker starts to think. The learning has been done elsewhere. Now, obviously, customers can refuse and not pay any attention to the recommendations that are being made to them. But the element of surprise that a customer might experience by browsing through sets of items with which they were completely unfamiliar is being lost when recommendations are being made. Now, the relevant reference and point of contrast here is to the broad and suggestive distinction made by Gilles Deleuze in his discussion of controlled societies. And we've seen some sort of kind of discussions on the side today about kind of logics of control operative in big data. Deleuze makes a distinction between controlled societies and disciplinary societies. It seems to me that this is a relevant reference, not least because of the way that big data often gets understood critically in relationship to questions of surveillance. However, if I refer to Deleuze's arguments about control, in particular to the idea that he has, when he talks about the difference between a society is organised around surveillance and discipline, he talks about the moulding of populations. In a controlled society, he talks about modulation of populations. I refer to Deleuze's arguments about control, and in particular to the idea of the modulation of populations, because I want to suggest that there is something of a discontinuity in the way in which statistics might be statistical analysis practices are operative within big data. So in the Foucauldian diagram of power, there are two key points about discipline. One, and this is why I think we can't talk in any simplistic way about big data and surveillance. Foucault is very important in kind of discussions about surveillance, but his argument about how surveillance works and why there is a power relation operative in surveillance actually is really quite specific. And the way in which discipline works in surveillance practices, what makes surveillance a power relationship is that it's the conscious awareness of the possibility that one might be being watched by the figure who sees without being seen that induces behavioural change. So Foucault has that figure of the panopticon, and the key thing about the panopticon is its architecture. There is a figure in the middle. You never know when you're a prisoner whether you're being looked at, but it is that consciousness that you might be being looked at that is the key thing in inducing shifts in behaviour. So that's one key point. And the second key point when we think about surveillance in terms of discipline is that knowledges of populations are closely connected to institutional context, so the kinds of hospitals, for example, that Professor Prof talked about this morning. Now, I think if I mention those 2 points, that is to underline where I think some of the discontinuity arises with big data, and why I think we might talk about it seriously in terms of the logic of control, in terms of that idea of modulating populations. With big data, the apparent ease of data collection is correlated to its invisibility. It's even essential to the successful operation of big data practice. I mean, you can imagine the kind of friction that would be produced if people were made consciously aware of the data being collected on them every time it was collected. Right? It is the ease of collection that makes big data so attractive in many ways. And whilst there might be panoptical qualities to big data, I would argue that there is a significant discontinuity. Not knowing about the data that's being collected or about how it's being used, the delinking of data from a strict fit with institutions under conditions of digital infrastructure can be interpreted as a shift from populations learning how to fit institutional moulds. What do I have to do to become a model pupil? What do I have to do to become a model soldier, a model prisoner, etc.? To populations understanding how to allow their behaviour to be continuously modulated. It's not essential to the way that big data practices operate that populations know that they might be being watched. It's not essential to big data practices that there is any crucial link to an institution, although granted there are in some very significant contexts there are those links. Any more than it's significant that the kinds of classifications that are effected through statistical analysis might pretend to have anything other than a temporary quality. So I mean, one of the points about some of those the way those statistical learning techniques are used, is that the classifications that they generate are continuously updated. So there isn't any sense that the knowledge one is generating, although one might be imputing it to people, to populations, there's no sense that this might be saying something about them as kind of subjects, in that kind of sense of something that underlies the changes that happens to them. So what indeed could become of stable distinctions between the normal and the pathological that might be associated with disciplinary institutions under conditions of continuous real-time monitoring and the analysis of populations that takes place in an institutionally viable space of digital infrastructure? Okay, I'm kind of drifting away a little bit from the more focused discussion of big data practice now into something a bit more speculative, to do with broader aspects of big data more generally. I'm not wedded to the kind of Foucauldian or Deleuzian way of thinking about big data. The things that I think are really, really important here are the kind of role of infrastructure, the uninterrogated role of information infrastructure in the generation of the data that gets analysed, and the kind of ways in which statistical analysis techniques tend to change and shift as they move from one location of practice, say kind of scientific practice like physics, for example, into another location. Of course, neural networks are not the only form of statistical learning method using big data practices. Likewise, recommendation systems are only one example of ways in which big data practices are instantiated. However, if I can make some fairly general points in conclusion, it seems to me that a constructively critical approach to big data needs to consider a number of things. First, big data is not one thing. It is a very heterogeneous and loosely connected set of practices. It may be becoming more coherent and being consolidated as something approaching one thing, but it is far from the case that it is there yet. Critical commentaries that talk about the era of big data, or that talk about the way in which data is fundamentally redefining what knowledge means, presume the unity of something that really isn't as unified as we might think. That's the first point. Second thing, I think it's very important if we're trying to think about and understand big data to dig carefully around the naturalising rhetoric that pervades discussions of data. Data is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. Data is always gathered under very specific conditions out of very specific sets of practices. Some of those practices may have happened a long time in the past. That still doesn't mean that data can be considered kind of naturalistically given. Third point is that one needs to develop a detailed understanding of the impact of informational infrastructures on what data is being collected and how that data is shaped. And that, I think, entails a much more considered approach to the software that is being used in data practices. Now, this is a comment where Meyer, Schoenberg and Foucault, for example, talk about algorithmists. They have a little bit of something of that nature in mind. I think actually their proposal needs to be developed and considered in a much deeper and more precise way. And finally, I think one needs to address much more carefully the ways in which practices that use tools and techniques of analysis work within big data. such as those kinds of algorithms that are operative in neural networks, for example, mutate and shift in their translation into big data practices. That, I think, is a pretty tall order. It's not something that I could possibly do by myself. It's something that the project that I've been involved in, the Meta Communities project, looking at GitHub, we found ourselves having to do in order to try to understand the data that we have been working with. But it does seem to me that if we do wish to get a more precise, analytically precise understanding of how big data practices operate and what their broader consequences are or may be, which I've speculated on a little bit here, it seems to me that these issues, these desiderata, if you like, are a crucial starting point. Thank you.
I make you compliments. Have you been feeling lonely? Questions, guys?
Good question. I think it's fascinating that you made a connection with the practice of science and how the instruments become critical part of their scientific inquiry. And I was reflecting on what is very quickly becoming very popular trend in our own field, using big data as a natural experiment, as they typically call. A lot of former IS economists, as they run out of data that they could use, quickly become data scientists, pull data from the social media and then produce a fairly large volume of publications now. And I think what is lacking there is critical sort of reflection on the precisely the type of limitations and assumptions that are built in these APIs that providers provide, through which they collect data and then produce scientific arguments. But yet I'm wondering if there is a way, or is there any obvious biases in their findings that can be attributed to such assumptions or the limits of the tools. Until then, I think it'll be fairly just a hollow argument that, oh, you should have examined or reflect on. So I'm just asking your reflection on perhaps you might have thought about your own research on GitHub that such and such as limitations led me to make following conclusions, and so I'm just wondering about your reflection on that.
Well, I mean, the work with GitHub, I mean, the API, as I understand it, has been used and is primarily used where people are trying to generate kind of data to analyse what's going on there. It tends to be used for people trying to understand how to optimise programming projects. So it tends to be involved in asking questions that are about trying to find the most efficient way of doing something, which is not. I don't think that's quite the same thing as say using it or trying to use it to ask questions about what is actually happening, or what is going on with coding practice. How is code being shared? How is code being pulled out of one repository? What is happening to it? Is it being pulled back into that repository? What might we reasonably infer is going on when that happens? And I think that's partly because of the way in which the API is kind of set up, because GitHub is a version controlled system. So it is designed for technical purposes. It's designed for engineers to keep track of their code. And I think that sets some quite terrific limitations on the kinds of questions that you can ask. Now, I think it's also fair to say that there hasn't been a vast quantity of work actually trying to analyse those kinds of repositories to raise these other kinds of questions. I mean, the work that is done which looks about optimisation of coding practice is very interesting, but that makes some assumptions about, well, what is it that's actually going on? What do we want to find out? We just want to find out what's most efficient. So I think the problem there really has to do, as we understand it, has to do with the kind of granularity of the data that you get back. There are only certain things that you can reasonably ask. You look at the actions, the committing actions that programmers programmers engaging, what you can infer from kind of picking apart different patterns of reaction is still for us very much Abstraction. We think having enormous problems trying to find anything out other than kind of very gross generalizations.
Yeah, so thanks for your talk. I just thought that having listened to most presentations today, I still have a bit of a hard time figuring out what exactly is the new thing in big data. So if I take my situation as a researcher with the research question, it seems that there's two ways to go about it using big data. Either start with a hypothesis and then test that hypothesis using big data methods, which then wouldn't be very different from regular quantitative research approaches, or to take the more radical approach that Maya Schoenberger advocates, to say that I don't need any theory or hypothesis, just look at the data and it will provide all the answers, which sounds very similar to the tradition of inductivism. So then the question would be, does the amount of data solve the inherent problems in inductivism? So let's say somebody had done a big data analysis on the color of all known swans before Australia was discovered. They still wouldn't have come up with any black swans. So how do you solve that, and how, or what would you say is the particular new thing in big data that's useful for us as researchers?
Well, I'm not entirely convinced there is a particular new thing from the point of view of the knowledge. I think there are issues about how when people say this is going to fundamentally redefine knowledge. I think that those kinds of claims are mistaken, and they're actually in some ways I think they're quite ignorant. So when someone says this allows us to forget about the scientific method. And when that sort of comment is treated respectively, you do wonder about the level of debate that is actually being had about big data. So I guess my response to your question would be to say, well, maybe if we want to understand what is different and new, maybe we have to look at the practices rather than maybe the logical structures of the knowledge that are produced. So clearly we can say, well, it is a kind of hyper associated, hyper kind of empiricist kind of associationism. That's interesting, but whether that really tells us very much, I'm not convinced. The reason why I was kind of saying I think we need to insist on some of the ways in which the practices might change as they move from one place to another. I think that is where one might start to learn about what is different. But I think the difference probably has more to do with organisation and practice than anything else. I think that would be my mission in fairly informed questions.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up Pickering, and you could bring up Latour and things right back, and you could say that in a scientific context, data inquiry using big data or other means is a way of inquiring into things that provide recalcitrance of some sort. It says to go further, and that you can say with Amazon they engage some sort of recommendation engine, or they try and crunch the data. It would be very difficult to say something definite about recalcitrance, because in particular if it deals with consumer behavior, because you have no way of knowing whether a consumer has not engaged in that situation. If you take the patients like me case, you could imagine there to be some sort of social recalcitrance where the patient would say, I think actually Nicola has examples of that, saying, I don't want to be classified like this. Yeah. But I think in most of the cases I've seen on big data use, that there is no obvious recalcitrance anywhere. Yeah. And in that sense, it falls way to the wayside of this notion of inquiring into a system that has the ability to offer you recalcitrance. And as such, I agree with your notion that this is like it's a technique. And I think that if you claim something as a technique, then automatically you cannot claim at the same time as a transforming thing. I mean, any technique that would not automatically be associated with transformation, and in that way you could see a long line of a tradition of the complexity and emergence back in the 90s, where the physicists were dragged around to show how organizations really were like physical systems, and now big data is just another round in the horse of the same the same surface in a sense.
I mean, but I think I agree with you to a large extent. I mean, I think it does do something. I mean, to say it's a technique is, or to say a technique is not to say it doesn't.
It's powerful.
It's very powerful. So it does do something. And the question for me then is, well, what exactly does it do, and how should one understand that? I mean, I didn't. I mean, I could have developed it, but I didn't. Stinger's actually had talks about what she calls techniques of influence, where she's talking about kinds of practices where you can't make distinctions between facts and artifacts, and she would talk about things like psychoanalysis in those terms. And there's a bit of me that wants to try and develop that argument as a way of thinking about the way in which, say, something like a recommendation system operates. It's a technique of influence. It pushes people to do things. It's not about revealing to people what they really want, as I think people have kind of said earlier on. It's about pushing people to buy something that we actually like them to have. I mean, it can't be criticised necessarily for that reason. I don't have a particular problem with that. What I'm interested in trying to tease apart is that, well, let's say that, and let's not try and kind of sugarcoat it with this kind of rhetoric of kind of scientific knowledge. And that's the bit that I think is a bit spurious.
If I make a point on this, if you would be consistent with what you say, then how do you answer your question? You have to look at the practices and how they assimilate or get assimilated by information, big data, and all this kind of thing. Would you agree with it?
Sure. I'd also just actually to the point about the. I mean, I think I talk about recommendation systems. I don't think that one can't consider that a metonym of big data, and I think you have to make empirical differentiations between something like healthcare of the kind of knowledge gathering practice that you may be talking about, and something that operates like a recommendation system. But those are kind of empirical questions from empirical perspective.
Just a quick
The last question.
You talked about the invisibility of this data analytics and how this is essential in the way they expand and are diffused. But what about software literacy and the capability of, or actually the lack of capabilities in understanding how these algorithms work and what they are doing to us? So do you differentiate between visibility as something that is mainly political and literacy or absence of IT skills?
Well, that's a very good question. To be perfectly honest, and to answer you quickly, it isn't something I hadn't really thought about it to that extent. I mean, when I'm talking about invisibility, maybe part of what I was thinking about as something that contrasts with friction. The point about the gathering of the data is that it has to be done, very, very, very easily. Otherwise, if a business had to really think about how they were gathering and ask people every time they gathered the data, they simply wouldn't do it. So I think there's something significant about the kind of friction-free nature of it that is essential to the way they operate. But the issue you asked about literacy software is a really considerable one. And I think one of the reasons why I want to insist on the importance of infrastructure so much is that questions around software and what software does, I think, are absolutely essential for these kinds of issues. I mean, it's kind of work I engage in more generally has to do with kind of software and the politics thereof. So you've touched on a very important issue.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.